How's it going, everyone? Happy Labor Day to all my fellow Canadians. I am James Lynch. This is Octagon Outlook, September 7th edition. Thank you so much for watching. We got a lot to talk about today, but we got to do some housekeeping off the top. First off, make sure you subscribe to the Line Movement YouTube channel, putting my best interviews on here every week. If you missed our interview with Mackenzie Dern on Friday, check that out after you're done watching this, of course. Really good stuff there from Mackenzie ahead of her fight against Randa Marcos. Make sure you follow me on Twitter and on Instagram at Lynch on Sports. And quick shout out to my producer, Jordan, who puts us together every week. Got to give him a shout out. He's doing an awesome job. Okay, so we got a lot to talk about. Let's start first with UFC Vegas 9, which went down at the UFC Apex last Saturday. And in the main event, it is Alistair Overeem. Father Time doesn't mean a thing. Alistair Overeem getting a win here, coming into this one with a fifth round, I should say, finish of Augusto Sakai in this one. Definitely ended up getting it done with Alistair Overeem getting back in the win column, or 2 straight wins, I should say, after coming off that win over Walt Harris. And same sort of story like in the Walt Harris fight, where Overeem was down early on the scorecards. Not as much danger as the Walt Harris fight. I mean, that Walt Harris fight, it really looked like he was going to win by first round TKO, and that did not end up happening. Overeem came back and knocked him out. And similar situation here, where Sakai looked great in the early going. I thought we were going to be seeing an Augusto Sakai decision victory at a certain point early on in this fight, but Overeem turned the tide, really opened up Augusto Sakai, and of course getting the ground and pound finish in the 5th round, getting it done. And Overeem now 47 wins in his career. We talked about this on the pre-show about the experience factor, in the sense that Overeem's just, he's fought the who's who, and while he does have a lot of knockout losses and a lot of setbacks in his career, he was a guy that just had a lot more to offer in this fight than Augusto Sakai. And not a bad loss for Sakai either, because like I said, he looked good in the early going. There was a lot of promise there about him getting this upset, but when you're fighting a guy who's Overeem, who made his MMA debut in 1999, you're really at odds here. It was basically Sakai basically needed a finish, I think, in order to get it done, and he wasn't able to do that. And even if he tried, Overeem showed in the last fight against Walt Harris that he could survive here. So Overeem gets the win. I'll talk a little bit more after we recap this card about what is next for Overeem. Some people saying John Jones, some people saying the Rosenstruck rematch. I'll give my thoughts on that after we wrap things up here. But for Sakai, you know what? First loss in the Octagon, not a bad one to have on the resume against a former title challenger and former Strikeforce champion in Alistair Overeem. I think the plan here is to just get him back on the winning track and continue to build him back up again. But I think his stock, if anything, went up in this fight just with the fact that he looked good early on and, showed that he could take on a guy in Overeem who's very well established in his career. So Sakai coming up short, but like I said, I think he'll only get better from here, making some adjustments. I think he's 29 years old, so he's a guy that can continue to prove in the heavyweight division going forward. How about the co-main event? I was wrong about this one. Ovince St. Preux with the counter left hook knockout over Alonzo Menefield in the fight. St. Preux looked pretty good in this one. Of course, they were supposed to fight a few weeks ago. COVID-19 knocking St. Preux out of the fight, so they rebooked it for here. And Menefield, he looked good. I thought there was a couple points where Menefield was going to finish OSP. His striking was on point. OSP, the bigger fighter with the height and reach advantage going into this one. And it was actually a counter that caught him. It was actually Menefield who landed a pretty good shot at first, and then OSP was able to capitalize and get the finish in the 2nd round. Not a lot to say about this fight. I mean, OSP, again, showing that he is a guy you cannot count out in the light heavyweight division. He actually set the record for most finishes in the light heavyweight division. And we forget how long OSP has been in this organization. He was a guy that came over from Strikeforce and continues to get really big wins in the win column, so to speak. So good win for him. I like him at light heavyweight. I think heavyweight was a mistake of the fight before that against Ben Rothwell, and obviously he didn't end up winning that one. But we'll see where he goes from here. I think there's a lot of options for him. He's a guy that's still kicking around. And, the one sort of knock on OSP, I know he did have the title shot against John Jones, but he really hasn't been able to, establish himself as a contender. But wins like this will definitely get him in that driver's seat. Menefield, a really promising prospect at 205 pounds. And now that's 2 straight losses for the former Fortis MMA product. Where does he go from here? I just think an easier fight. Menefield, came into this one with a lot less experience than OSP. Menefield's a Contender Series guy who had a nice run in the UFC leading up to that Devin Clark fight. He loses that one, and now he gets finished in this fight. So back to the drawing board for him. I think sort of like a gatekeeper fight next would be good for Menefield, maybe like a Misha Serkinov, someone like that, where, it'll be a little bit more competitive, a little bit more smaller gap in terms of the experience for his next fight. But I do think Menefield's a guy we can't write off just yet. He is, in his 30s, so he's not a guy who's like late 30s, like, oh, this was it. But I think he'll learn from this and learn to move on in his career. And with OSP, a lot of good options for him going forward. The division's really picking up, and we're seeing sort of a changing in the guard as John Jones leaves the division. So I think any of those top guys in the top 15 would be a good matchup for OSP next. But nothing really stands out. But still, this is a huge win for OSP to show that he is still relevant in the 205-pound division. How about Michelle Pereira? This is what everyone was talking about on the weekend. Here's a guy that's known for being very flashy and entertaining, but usually it backfires. Look at the Tristan Connolly fight. He ended up losing that one. The Diego Sanchez fight, that was a DQ loss in that one. But ultimately, he proved he was the better fighter than Imadiev in this fight. Imadiev, I should say. I think I butchered that wrong on the preview show. Not going to butcher it here today. Imadiev just having no answers, and this was a total beatdown. Probably the best performance of Pereira's career. Maybe not the same highlight reel finish that we're used to, like in the Danny Roberts fight, but still to go out there and get a submission win like that, very impressive. I know some people felt it was a little bit controversial, but I mean, either way, Pereira was winning that fight. I don't think there was ever an idea that Imadiev was going to come back with anything and, upset Pereira. So really complete performance. I like what Pereira is doing, really putting things together and not just, being this entertaining guy. He's actually, making sure he's landing, making sure he's up on the judges' scorecard. So it's not a case of him, going in there and trying to impress as opposed to getting the victory. He got the victory. A lot of options for him going forward. Mike Perry, I think, would be a fun fight. There's a lot of good options for him at welterweight right now, but here's a guy that, especially if he can get his English going, I think he's a guy that they could really push in the welterweight division. But this was the first step in what I think a lot of fans knew was capable of Michelle Pereira. So good win for him. And Imadiev, that's likely it for him in the UFC. Just crazy antics even leading up to the fight. I talked about the whole Max Griffin fight leading up to that one as well, where he was trying to mean mug him leading up to that fight. Just bad news all around. This guy is not UFC caliber, in my opinion. I think you could cut him at this point with him losing the way he did to Michelle Pereira. But like I said, the man of the weekend was Michelle Pereira. Really big win for him, and his stock is only going up. And then also on the main card, I mean, this was pretty much all main card fights because of all the COVID issues and everything sort of going down there. Andre Muniz getting a quick finish over Bartosz Vanbinsky. Great win, great submission win. It always looks good on the resume when you can get a first round finish like he did in that one. I thought that was super impressive as far as what he was able to do. And I just, couldn't say enough good things about Muniz in this fight. 20-4 record now overall. He's a guy to watch out for at middleweight. I think maybe next time out, maybe a top 15 guy, but we'll see. Certainly look good on Saturday and excited to see what is next for him. We'll go through the last three fights just because, again, there's not a whole lot to talk about on here. Brian Kelleher looked great against Ray Rodriguez. How crazy is this? So Kelleher supposed to fight Ricky Simon. Simon's out due to a cornerman testing positive for COVID-19. They have him fighting Kevin Navadiad instead. Navadiad's out of the fight. I think it was COVID related, but they never actually confirmed it. So insert Ray Rodriguez, who's a guy I've had the pleasure of interviewing a handful of times leading up in his career on the regional scene. He fought for LFA, he's fought for Combate, he's fought for Contender Series, if you remember. Always came up short, but got this fight on short notice. And unfortunately, I don't know what happened in the fight, but just, never a good idea trying to, go to the ground with Brian Kelleher. Kelleher capitalized on that, getting a submission win. And good for Brian Boom Kelleher, big New York Islanders fan, by the way. Kelleher getting back in the win column. He had a really tough draw in his last fight before that against Cody Stamann, where he's fighting a guy where basically everyone's rooting against him. Stamann had lost his brother leading up to the fight. Everyone wanted to see, Stamann get this victory for his brother who had tragically passed away. So Brian Kelleher in kind of this no-win situation ends up losing that fight. So for him to go out there and get another finish, very impressive. Kelleher's a sneaky guy in that division. You can't count him out. I see a lot of people saying, oh, do him and Sean O'Malley. I don't even know if that's a good fight for O'Malley next, to be honest. I think Kelleher's pretty dangerous, and I don't think that's the type of risk the UFC wants to put on a Sean O'Malley here. But really big win for Kelleher, another submission victory. I say rebook the Ricky Simon fight. I know generally when you have a fight scheduled and the guy wins, you don't do that, but seems like he wants it. Seems like Simone wants it as well, too. I'm sure he's going to be good to go here soon. So if Kelleher wants to get another fight in here, especially at 45, let's not forget this was not a bantamweight fight. Kelleher getting to keep those extra pounds on. I think that's a fight that could clearly make a lot of sense going forward. So give me Kelleher and Simone. And for Rodriguez, I'm sure he'll get another fight. This was short notice. I'd like to see him in his natural weight class at bantamweight and getting a full camp. I think he'll be a lot better in the next fight. How about Viviana Rujo improving to 9-2 overall, getting a decision win over Montana De La Rosa. Just a complete performance, a really solid outing by Rujo in this one. And De La Rosa now losing again. She's really struggled with consistency in the Octagon. I thought the change in camps might have put her over the top in this one, but she's now lost 2 of her last 3 fights. Not sure where she goes from here at 25 years old. You would think they want to continue to build her up as someone who's pretty marketable in the division with her fight style and obviously the fact that she's very young, but we'll see what the UFC decides to do there. But the Rujo, really big win here. She's going to definitely get a formidable opponent after this with getting such a dominant win over Montana De La Rosa. And opening up the card, we had Hunter Azure getting a decision win over Cole Smith. No real surprises here. I thought Azure being a little bit more active and just the fact that I think is a little bit better on paper proved to be true in this fight. Now, I thought Azure clearly was ahead in those first 2 rounds. Cole Smith looking good in the third, but ultimately it was not enough. I do wonder at this point with Smith now losing back-to-back fights if he may want to try a different weight class. He's a pretty big bantamweight. I wonder if he would want to consider maybe going up to 145, seeing if the cut's different, or we'll see. I mean, but Cole Smith, if you remember, came into the UFC undefeated. He's now lost back-to-back fights, back-to-back decision losses, I should say. The Miles Johns fight was a little bit closer than this one, but Azure, showing that he's the real deal, and I think he's a guy that's going to get a top 15 opponent here pretty soon with the win over Cole Smith. Like I said, looked pretty good overall in this fight, and Cole Smith back to the drawing board, but I do think the UFC will give him one more just because he took that first UFC fight on short notice, which he ended up winning over Mitch Gagnon. So pretty decent card overall. I don't mind the cards that are a little bit, less in terms of the fights, even with all the COVID changes. I like when you're not, just bombarded with 13 fights every single card. So I was a big fan of that, but I mentioned it off the top there. A lot of people asking what is going to be happening next with Alistair Overeem in the main event. And I heard a lot of people suggest Jon Jones. Now, it should be noted, and I think, this was mentioned a little bit, but I'll mention it again, that Alistair Overeem and Jon Jones used to train together back in the day at Jackson Wink. So there is a friendship there. I'm sure they put that aside for this fight, especially with the dollar signs there. But honestly, I don't think this is a fight that's going to end up happening. And let me explain for a few reasons. First off, they are friends. So I could see that maybe being something, but although Overeem has said that he'd be willing to fight him, and I'm sure Jon would be game as well, but I don't really see what you have to gain here. I think with Jon Jones, the fact that he is a champion, you could either give him that title shot right off the bat at heavyweight, or you could give him someone ranked a little bit higher. Now, Overeem, I understand, big win for him, obviously wants to continue that momentum, but I almost think it's a bit of a risk there for Jones, because what if he doesn't beat Overeem? Then you sort of kill that cash cow. At least if he fought, say, for the title, or he fought a guy like Ngannou, who's like right at the edge of winning the title, I think there's a little bit more incentive for Jon to take that fight. I think for heavyweight, I think you go for broke with Jon Jones, because he's looked unstoppable so far. So let's give him the toughest opponents yet. We know there's a weakness with Overeem where he does tend to get finished, and he didn't get finished on Saturday, but he did run into some trouble there. And same thing with the Walt Harris fight, Overeem had some trouble early on there as well. So I don't think you need to do the Overeem and Jon Jones fight right now. I'd like to see Jones either get a title shot or someone like close to that. And plus, I don't think financially it's going to line up this year. That's not a fight that's going to happen in 2020. Jon Jones, I've said this before, I don't think he'll come back till next year, until we potentially get crowds back, or until the UFC is going to open up their wallet. Because let's make no mistake about it, Jon Jones is moving up to heavyweight because he's going to want to make more money. There's more money fights for him at heavyweight than there are at light heavyweight right now. It has nothing to do with competition. It has everything to do with dollar signs. So I don't think Jon Jones and Alistair Overeem will happen next. I think with Overeem, if Volkov beats Walt Harris, you could do that fight. I realize Volkov's coming off a loss to Curtis Blades, but I think that makes a little bit more sense just to keep Overeem active. And you never know what's going to happen with the heavyweight title picture. What if Ngannou gets injured? What if, there could be a number of different factors that could happen at the top. So you want to have some options. I think Overeem is sort of a guy on the outside, much like his teammate Curtis Blades, who's fighting Derek Lewis. I think there's a lot of options you could do with Overeem as well, but I don't think the Jones fight makes sense right now, just because even though Overeem's a huge name, I just think Jon has done more than enough to deserve someone higher caliber at this point. So I don't think it happens, and I don't want to see it happen. I'm going to stick with that. Okay, we got a card to talk about this weekend, UFC Vegas 10, which took a bit of a hit last week. As we know, Thiago Santos, Glover Teixeira not headlining this card. Glover Teixeira testing positive for COVID-19. They have since moved that fight to October 2nd, and now we have Angela Hill and Michelle Waterson headlining the card. A bit of history here. Angela Hill becoming the first African-American woman to headline a UFC event, so kudos to her. And, I don't mind to see seeing the women headline a card like this. It's one of their, more promising divisions. I know a lot of fans are kind of groaning at the idea, but I think it's a good showcase for the strawweight division, and I think it's a pretty solid main event, especially for a fight night card in terms of the matchup. But we're going to start on the prelims, and we're going to start with this fight between Sabina Mazo and Justine Kitch. Let's look at BlitzBet. Do they have odds for this yet? They do not, but that's fine. We can still just talk about the fight anyways. Either way, Sabina Mazo on most books is a pretty heavy favorite at this point, going into this one over Justine Kitch. And with good reason. Mazo has a lot of advantages. She's way younger. Mazo coming into this fight at 22 years of age, I believe. Let me check. 23. Gave her too much credit there, but 23 years old. But here's the key thing about Mazo. She's 5'7" with a 70-inch reach. So Justine Kitch is going to have to deal with that height and reach, and against an opponent who's been a lot more active than Kitch has. If you remember, Kitch didn't fight at all in 2019 due to an injury. So she came back earlier this year, got the decision win over Lucy Pudilova. But in general, Kitch is someone that's, been off for a while due to a lot of injuries in her career. And then even before that, she wasn't fighting at flyweight. She was fighting at strawweight for the most part. If you remember her debut, and even before that, were all strawweight fights. So she's been at flyweight now since 2018, but Mazo's a big flyweight at that. So Kitch comes into this one at 5'5" with a 65-inch reach, whereas Mazo's 5'7" with a 70-inch reach. So she's going to have a 5-inch reach advantage, Mazo, and has a little bit of a height advantage. So I do think that'll play a role in this fight. The thing I get a little bit worried about is that Kitch has a lot more experience in terms of opponents that she's fought. She's fought really good fighters over her career. Felice Herrig, she's fought Ashley Yoder, Nina Ansaroff, she has a win over her, Randa Marcos. I mean, these are all solid performances. And then even her losses, Kim and those are not really bad losses on the resume. Whereas Mazzo, she's looked okay. I mean, the last fight I think was a little too close for comfort against JD Aldrich, where she went to split decision in that one. But before that, she got a nice win over Shauna Dobson. It's a case of a prospect versus a veteran in this one. I'm going to pick Sabina Mazzo in this fight, but I would warn you that I think the line is a little bit too high in a lot of these books where it's just like, it's crazy to think that she's so heavily favored over a fighter who has a lot more experience here. So that is something to keep in mind. But I do think Mazzo will use her height and reach to her advantage. And I think we're going to see a better version of her in this fight. I think she knew that last fight wasn't her best performance, and I think she'll look even better in this one. So the pick is going to be Mazzo. But like I said, I think that some of the lines I'm seeing, it's a little bit too steep for my liking as far as betting this fight. Let's keep it on the prelims here. We're going to go to this really interesting matchup against Bryan Barbarina and Anthony Ivey. It's really interesting for a couple of reasons. First off, Bryan Barbarina has not fought since the Randy Brown fight, and that was back in June of last year. And that's because Bryan Barbarina had back surgery. Not great to hear when you're a fighter, when you're getting a serious surgery like that. But Barbarina put in the work. He did the surgery, he did the rehab, he did everything else to get ready for this fight, and he says he's good to go. I actually interviewed him leading into this fight, and an interesting thing in an interview is that he mentioned he was up to 250 pounds at the height of quarantine. So this is a guy who fights at 170. That's pretty frightening and concerning to hear something like that. But speaking to him a few weeks ago, he did get the weight down. He's on point. That's no longer an issue for him. But still, your body's got to be a little bit out of whack when you're going down that much in weight. So Barbarina training at home for this camp at Jimmo's. That's a gym that also has Scott Holtzman and has Joe Selecki. So Barbarina getting in a pretty good camp. The layoff is a bit concerning, but at 31 years old, you got to look at who he's fought in the UFC. Here's a guy that, he lost to Brown. That's a fight that, could have gone maybe differently if Barbarina was 100% healthy, but he's losing to Vicente Luque, Leon Edwards, Colby Covington. These are the top of the top in the welterweight division. So some of his losses are not bad. And then his wins have looked good. The TKO win over Joe Proctor in the first round, the TKO win over Jake Ellenberger in the first round. This is a guy that goes out there to finish and to make an exciting fight. Now, Anthony Ivey had a pretty disappointing debut, losing in 58 seconds to Christian Aguilera in his last fight. Looking to bounce back on this one. He's never actually lost back-to-back fights in his career, so that's kind of interesting looking at that. But here's a guy that needs his first UFC win, and he's been a little bit more active than his opponent in Bryan Barbarina. But how I look at this fight is that if Barbarina looks anything close to what he looked like even before the surgery, and he looked anywhere close to what we've seen in all of his fights, I think he wins this one. I think he's the better fighter on paper. The only concern in this fight is the fact that he's had such a long layoff and that he is coming off surgery. Certain fighters, when they've been off for that long, they don't tend to look the same. But I think Barbarina will look close to how he looked because he is 31. We're not talking about a 38-year-old. We're talking about a guy who's in the prime of his career right now, and I think he knows what's at stake here, trying to get a win here because Barbarina's lost back-to-back fights, a third straight loss. I don't think it would cut him from the UFC because he's very entertaining, but it is something where, he's got to think about that in the back of his head. But I think he's the better fighter overall than Anthony Ivey, and I think Bryan Barbarina is going to score either a knockout or a submission in this fight. So keep an eye out for that in this fight because I think right now he's about a 2-1 favorite. But if you can find it sort of an inside the distance prop, I think that might be worth it in this matchup. But give me Bryan Barbarina, bam, bam in this fight to get it done. I just think he's the better fighter overall, and I have a pretty good read on him as far as him getting the win here. Also on this card, we're going to talk about Matt Schnell and Tyson Nam on the prelims as well in the flyweight division. Really awesome fight. If we're looking here on the odds, do we have odds? We do not have that for that fight yet, but I'm seeing a lot of books where you're having Tyson Nam as the favorite, and I know that he was actually opened as the underdog, which I find interesting because I actually like Matt Schnell in this fight. Now, Schnell has not fought since December where he was finished by Alexander Panchota. But I think in general, you look at his body of work in the flyweight division, had some pretty impressive wins, like the win over Luis Smolka. You look at some of the fighters that he's taken on. Jordan Espinoza finished him. I mean, those are good wins for him. He was on a 4-fight win streak before the Panchota loss. There could be a variety of reasons why he lost that fight. Maybe he went in there a little bit overconfident. I'm not entirely sure what happened to him in that fight, but he's a dad now. We've seen Dad Cerrone. Maybe the same thing here will apply to Matt Schnell. And the other thing with Matt Schnell in this fight is that he's training at Fortis MMA, which I think is a great move for him. You mentioned how back home he wasn't getting the type of training he'd like. So going over to Texas, working with Saif Saud and working with, some of their flyweights and, well, not flyweights, but bantamweights and featherweights they have over there, like Ocho Peterson, like Miles Johns, just getting really solid work in. And he talked, when I spoke to him before this fight, he mentioned just, how Saif really establishes a very high standard at his gym. gym. So I think him getting that look is perfect for this fight. And I do see him going out there and getting it done. Now with Tyson Nam, it's the opposite. He told me basically when I spoke to him that in Hawaii, a lot of the gyms are closed right now. So he's getting very limited training. That's a concerning thing in this fight, not to mention the fact Tyson Nam's 6 years older than Matt Schnell. While, Nam has the experience, Matt Schnell has the UFC experience where he's looked pretty good overall in the octagon, other than a couple fights, like I mentioned. So Matt Schnell, with the fact that he's also, younger, has a height and reach advantage in this one, why would I not take him here? I'm going to take him by decision. I think he gets it done over Tyson Nam. And if you guys can get plus money on that, go for it, because I definitely think it's worth it in this one, as I see Danger getting back in the win column to round out the prelims on this card. Let's move along to the main card now. We got a bit of a switch up in this one. It is Sijara Eubanks taking on Julia Avila now. I was supposed to be Sijara Eubanks and Carl Rosa. Rosa testing positive for COVID-19. So she is out of that fight. That was actually supposed to happen on the UFC Fight Night card back on August 5th. Initially, it was Macy Chasson. Then it was Carol Rosa. Rosa test positive for COVID-19. So they moved that fight. Rosa's still not ready to go. So insert Julia Avila, who's supposed to fight Nico Montano like 5 times already. And then Montano also tested positive for COVID-19. So it's a pair of fighters who are coming together due to COVID-19. Let's just leave it at that. But I'm seeing a lot of books right now where Avila is a huge favorite right now, just with the fact that she's looked pretty solid in the octagon. And I do want to warn some people on this, because I agree. I think Avila's look great, but let's take a little bit of a closer look at what she's been able to do in the octagon. So her debut, if you remember, was on short notice against Pani Kianzad. Looked great in that one, got the win there. No complaints there. That was a solid win. Her second fight was against Gina Mazzani, who is someone that just happened to be in Vegas training. If you remember, she was cut from the UFC after losing a bunch of fights, and then got a win at King of the Cage against an under 500 opponent, and then came back in there, and Avila just destroyed her. And she could very well do that in this fight. I mean, Avila could be the real deal, but I just think people, like we've seen before, tend to romanticize too much about the last fight. And you got to look at, she fought Gina. Like if Gina Mazzani fought Sijara Eubanks, I think Eubanks would absolutely dominate her in that fight. So we can't really take away too much from that last performance. I know she looked good, but it's Gina Mazzani we're talking about here. We're not talking about, Amanda Nunes or some like top fighter in that bantamweight division right now. So I do warn people a little bit. Well, Avila should be favored, not by that much. I'm seeing her as almost a 3-1 favorite on some books. It's nuts. Eubanks, she's kind of had an up and down career. Was at flyweight for a bit, had some good wins there over Lauren Murphy and Roxanne Modafferi, but missed weight a couple times. So she moves up to bantamweight, has struggled a little bit, but look at who she's fighting. Aspen Ladd. That's a fight that was pretty close, in my opinion, before Ladd ended up winning the decision. The Betch Cahill fight, just a really disappointing performance from Sarge in that fight. I think if they rematched, it might be a different story. And then the Sarah Morris fight, just total domination. Sarah wasn't in that fight at all. Sarge looked really good in that one. So I see this being kind of like a war, but I do think Avila will go out there and edge it out. But just at the odds that how they are right now, I could see this being a closer fight than the odds indicate. So my advice for this one is, if anything, if you're looking to bet, I might even go on the dog in this one. But I do think Avila is the better fighter, and I think she'll get it done a little bit younger, a little bit more polished, shown a little bit more than what we've seen in the octagon. But my worry, like I said, is that people are putting way too much stock in that Gina Mazzani win, which I don't think. I mean, Mazzani at this point, I think, is a regional fighter. I love her. She's a great interview, fun to watch, but I just don't think she's UFC caliber. So I can't put too much stock into that win. So I'm going to go Avila by decision in this fight. You might even look for the Avila by decision prop too. That might be worth a stab, because Eubanks, very tough to finish. Let's move along to the light heavyweight division. A bit of a switch up in this one. We have Ed Herman now taking on Mike Rodriguez. It was supposed to be John Allen. Allen couldn't get in, I'm assuming, to visa issues. So Mike Rodriguez now stepping up. Rodriguez just fought a few weeks ago, getting a UFC victory a little while back there. Let's check out what I'm talking about here. This was Marcin Prashino. He defeated him back on August 22nd. So Emrod getting right back in the saddle. And Herman, I believe this is his 5th opponent he's gone through. He's had a whole bunch. If you remember, he's supposed to fight Daeun Jung, supposed to fight Mershart back on August 1st. That ended up getting canceled because Mershart tested positive for COVID-19. They rebooked the Mershart fight, only for Mershart to again not get to take this fight, because I guess his gym was closed down. So Herman, again had to fight John Allen. Then Allen can't come through, so insert Emrod in this fight. And I see Rodriguez is the favorite in this one going into it. And I can understand that, coming off a lot of momentum from that last win. And if you go on BlitzBet right now, blitzbet.eu, for any of our Canadian watchers out here, you can get Mike Rodriguez right now for about -263, Ed Herman +205. Kind of like the last fight, I say be a little bit careful here. Now, look, Mike Rodriguez, like I mentioned, momentum from his last win, getting the finish in the first round looked great. But the fight before that, remember, he got knocked out by Daeun Jung. Fight before that, he went to a no contest against John Allen. Had the win over Adam Milstead, but Milstead no longer in the UFC, and he got absolutely outclassed in his debut against Devin Clark. So I do warn people a little bit in the sense that I don't think we've seen what Mike Rodriguez is capable of. Maybe he is good enough to beat Ed Herman, but I think when you're fighting a guy in Herman, who, by the way, has been in the UFC since 2006, this is a guy who's defying father time at this point, 39 years old, and he's still getting wins. He's actually coming off back-to-back victories in his last two fights. So I see a bit of a warning in this one where Herman might be able to go out there and persevere and get it done, because when you have that much experience, Herman's got a 24-14 record. That's nothing to mess with. I think if you looked at last weekend's card, experience did pay off. OSP, right? More experienced guy, got the win over Menefield. Overeem, more experience than Sakai, got the win. So I just sort of warn people, if you're looking at this fight, I don't think Mike Rodriguez is a slam dunk here. If anything, I do see some value here on Ed Herman. However, Rodriguez a lot more active. In terms of what he's been able to do, already fought this year. Herman's had so many fight cancellations. That's got to mess with your head a little bit. And just the fact that he is 39, whereas Rodriguez is only 31 years old. So I'm going to take Rodriguez probably by decision in this one. I don't think he finishes Ed Herman. Herman has been finished by Krylov, for example, but that was back in July of 2016. I think he ends up keeping this one a pretty competitive back and forth type of fight. So I'll take Rodriguez by decision, but I would personally stay away from betting Rodriguez in this fight because I think there's still too many question marks on him in the light heavyweight division. All right, our next fight at lightweight is a pretty simple one to break down, in my opinion. We've got Alan Patrick, I think that's how you say it, Patrick, doesn't matter, taking on Bobby Green. Bobby Green with a nice little turnaround, taking the fight here. And right now, if you look on the Blitz Bet, we don't have odds for that yet, but I know that Bobby Green is a favorite in this one, and that's the way I see this fight as well. Green really showed that he's made some changes in his last couple fights, getting that really dominant win over Lando Venata in his last fight. Looked really great in that one. If you remember, Green went on a streak where he was, I think he had lost 5 of 6, and had a draw and a win in between there. But his last two fights, he's looked good, getting the decision over Clay Guida, getting the decision over Lando Venata. Bobby Green is still a good striker, and we forget that Green isn't that old. He's only 33. I mean, that's not terribly old for the lightweight division. So I think we just think of him as being older because he's been in the UFC for a while, fought in Strikeforce, has been in the MMA, it's fought in MMA since we'll go all the way back here to 2008. So it's been a long career for Bobby Green. And Alan Patrick, are you like me and you kind of forgot he was on the roster? 37 years old, has not fought since October of 2018. A guy that old and coming into a fight like this with such a long layoff, very concerning. And let's also look at the fact that he was finished in his last fight by Scott Holtzman, a guy who generally does not finish a lot of his fights. So that's a bit concerning as well here too. I think Bobby Green's either going to win a decision or win by knockout, but there's no way I could recommend Alan Patrick in this fight. I think Bobby Green has all the advantages here. Give me Bobby Green by decision to get a pretty dominant win over Alan Patrick to keep his winning streak going and make it 3 straight for the California native. Let's get to the co-main event. We've got a rematch here between Andrea Lee and Roxanne Modafferi. And right now, if you go on Blitz Bet, Andrea Lee minus 323, Roxanne Modafferi plus 250. Again, I think the odds are a little high here. I do like Andrea Lee in this fight, but I think Roxanne Modafferi is someone you can't count out. Just ask Macy Barber about that. Modafferi getting a huge win there. So their first fight, I don't think it really bears any sort of, significance in this fight. It was Andrea Lee's third pro fight. She lost to Modafferi by split decision at Invicta FC 10 back in December of 2014. I mean, we're talking, 6 years ago. It's been a very long time since they fought, and both are very different fighters since then. So I can't put too much stock into that first fight. But Andrea Lee, her last 2 fights, they've been close. 2 split decision losses. The first one to Joanne Calderwood, which I think was a little bit clearer that Calderwood won that fight. But the Lauren Murphy fight, that was on that UFC 247 card, which just had some awful judging. And if you go on MMADecisions.com right now, you'll see that not a single media member scored the fight for Lauren Murphy, that Andrea Lee should have won that fight. So realistically, Lee could be in the UFC already. She could be 4-1 as opposed to 3-2. So Lee, in my opinion, still one of the top flyweights in that women's flyweight division. Modafferi coming off that loss to Lauren Murphy as well, and then had the win over Macy Barber and the loss to Jennifer Maia before that. Modafferi's really struggled with consistency. Her last, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 fights have alternated between wins and losses. So she's really struggled to find her footing in the octagon here. And she is fighting some tough competition, but still, you got to put it together at a certain point here. So Modafferi comes to us from Syndicate MMA. Andrea Lee actually trained pretty much the most of her camp at MMA Gold with Aspen Ladd. Now, Ladd's obviously out, but getting to work with her team. So that's like Mario Renault, Anthony Fluffy Hernandez, Autumn Norton, who's going to be fighting in Invicta. So she's had a lot of good looks for this camp, a lot of good training from what I've said. If you watch her interview with her here on our channel, she just talked about how good camp went and how there were no distractions. And she basically could just focus on the fight itself. I believe her daughter was back home, so she was having to be in mom mode. She She was just basically focused on the task at hand here. So, and then also let's talk about the height and reach as well. Modafferi is 5'6" with a 69.5-inch reach, whereas Modafferi is 5'7" with a 69-inch reach. So the reach is the same. Modafferi a little bit taller, but Andrea Lee way younger here, 31 years old. Modafferi is 37. Give me Andrea Lee by decision. I think she gets it done. Would I play minus 310 or whatever the odds were there that I just mentioned? Not whatever. I'll just say it right here. It was minus 323. That's way too steep for my liking. I would look at the decision prop, if anything. I think Lee hasn't finished a fight since 2017. Modafferi has not been finishing a fight since 2013 when she was fighting at, I believe, bantamweight on The Ultimate Fighter. She lost to Jessica Rakoczy. So Modafferi, very difficult to finish. This is going the distance. I think regardless, you could play this fight goes to the decision prop, no doubt about it. These two are not finishers, but give me Andrea Lee to get her hand raised and get back in the win column to snap that 2-fight losing streak. Okay, let's get to the main event. Like I mentioned it, a new main event. We've got Michelle Waterson and Angela Hill. Their fight was rescheduled. They are now the main event of this card due to the fact that Teixeira and Santos are out. Angela Hill right now is the favorite at minus 128 over on blitzbet.eu. Michelle Waterson, the underdog at plus 105. I'm going with the dog in this one. I think there's a lot of value on Michelle Waterson. Now, one of the knocks on Michelle Waterson in her entire career has been that she's undersized for strawweight, and I tend to agree with that. I think if she was at atomweight, she'd be at her best. And you've seen her struggle with the size in certain matchups, like with Yana and Jacek, like with Rose Namajunas. Those were fights where she was the smaller fighter. But in this case, it's not really much of a factor here. Waterson, 5'3" with a 62-inch reach. Angela Hill, 5'3" with a 64.5-inch reach. So just a little bit of a reach advantage and a little bit of a height advantage for Angela Hill. It's not going to be, actually, they're both 5'3". So height-wise, they're pretty much the same. So we can cancel that out. Now, if you look at this fight on paper, who's been more impressive? It's Michelle Waterson, in my opinion. She did lose her last fight to Carla Esparza, but Esparza is still a really solid wrestler. She's been on a nice winning streak in the Octagon, looking pretty good there. Yan Jacek, she beats most strawweights not named Rose Namajunas, so chalk that up there as well. And then before that, she had a 3-fight win streak over Courtney Casey, Felice Herrig, and Karolina Kovacevic. So those are all good wins for Michelle Waterson in this one. For Angela Hill, she's been a bit up and down. I thought she did beat Claudia Gadelha in her last fight. She could very well be on a 4-fight win streak, but you remember, it wasn't that long ago, actually last year, she got finished by Randa Marcos. Randa Marcos is not a fighter to finish people. So Hill does have these blips every now and then, where at least with Waterson, she's not getting finished. She's losing very close fights in a lot of her matchups. In fact, the last time she was finishing a fight was back in April of 2017 when she lost to Rose Namajunas, I think in just a couple fights in, or third or fourth fight in the UFC here. So I think Waterson at dog money, with the fact that, again, I think on paper she's a little bit better, a little bit more established, a little bit more impressive. I'm going to take her at this, and I think she'll win a decision here. I don't think she'll finish Angela Hill. Hill very durable. If you want to go back all the way to the Marcos fight, and then even before that, she lost to Namajunas as well back in 2015. Hill's very tough to finish, but I don't know. I feel like Angela Hill's, she's a fan favorite. Everyone likes her, from the Street Fighter stuff to, her dressing up to, her being into anime and doing all this other stuff. I feel like that's kind of swaying the line a little bit, whereas people are overlooking Waterson. But also, I got to mention this because this is getting a little political. We don't tend to not talk about politics on here, but Waterson was supporting Dana White at the RNC, the Republican National Convention, and a lot of fans turned on Michelle Waterson, being like, why are you supporting Trump and all that? So I think that's also playing into this, to be honest, where people are like, they don't like Waterson because she supports Trump, and Angela Hill's obviously a Democrat, so they're like over on her as well too. So I could see this line getting blown up even more, and I think if Angela Hill gets to like a 2-1, I think you absolutely have to bet Waterson. But I think even right now you could bet her at plus 105. I see some value there in Michelle Waterson. So give me Waterson by decision for the upset. Might be a little crazy here, but I think she gets it done over Angela Hill and gets the job done on Saturday night in the main event. So before we get to Bellator, I wanted to quickly go on my rant here of Nick Diaz, because that's been in the news a lot. Ariel Helwani posted that video yesterday speaking to his manager, Nick Diaz's manager, saying that Nick Diaz is teasing a return. If there's one of the things I hate hearing about in this sport, it's about a Nick Diaz return, because I feel like we've been talking about this for years. Nick Diaz hasn't fought since the Anderson Silva fight back in 2015. I'm just going to pull up his record here so I actually know what I'm talking about here. But if you go on Ariel Helwani's Twitter right now, he says, this is Nick Diaz earlier today. He weighs in the 175, 165 pound range per his manager. He just completed a 14-week diet and training regimen. This is the first time he cuts weight in approximately 4 years. Diaz wanted to do a test cut because he is close. He is hearing a close eye on the welterweight fights coming up. He's 100% planning on fighting again, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's great and all, but Nick Diaz has not fought since a January 2015 no contest against Anderson Silva in a fight that I didn't think he looked great in. A lot of people loved that fight. I didn't. I thought he was goofing around. He was lying down on the mat. I mean, the Nick Diaz that we're used to seeing that comes forward and everything. I mean, he's literally going like this to Anderson Silva saying, hey, fight me. It's like, do you know what you're talking about here? You're talking about one of the greatest fighters ever in Anderson Silva. So that was nuts. And then before that, he lost back-to-back fights to Condit and St. Pierre. So Nick Diaz, if he does in fact come back next year, will be looking for his first win. Get this, since October of 2011. Now, look, I'm not a doctor. I don't know. I just sit here and talk fights. If you saw Nick Diaz's social media over the last 5 years, it's not like he was in the gym training and preparing for a fight. He was out partying. I don't think this is a good idea, him coming back. I don't know how he's going to look in the octagon I guess he'll be, he's turning 38 this year at the end of the year. Well, actually, he just turned 37 actually on the 2nd. So he'll be 38 next year, a year from now. I just don't know how it's going to go. I mean, what fighters come back older after a 5-year layoff and look better and come back and win the title, other than maybe like a Dominic Cruz? But even Cruz, he's not as old as Nick Diaz is. So this talk of Nick Diaz coming back, I'll just say this to everyone out there: don't get excited, because until even if he signs the papers, even if Nick Diaz signs the papers, until he actually steps in the octagon and takes the fight, I wouldn't get excited. And I personally don't want to see Nick Diaz in the UFC anymore. We know the weakness he has on the ground in terms of him getting taken down by wrestlers. That's why in Strikeforce, they never matched him up against any wrestlers. You'll notice it was always strikers like Paul Daly and all these other guys. And then when he got to the UFC, he couldn't handle the wrestling. Guys like Condit and St. Pierre were able to take him down. Even when he fought a striker in Anderson Silva, he didn't have any match for it. So I just don't see this return coming back very well. I get on Diaz's end, he probably wants to come back on a win. But I would say two things about the Nick Diaz news. Number one, don't get excited until he actually walks in the octagon. I mean, this was the same guy where Dana White decided to put in Carlos Condit against George St. Pierre instead of Nick Diaz, because Diaz was having such a hard time with making it to press conferences and everything else. So there's that factor. And then there's just the factor of what type of Nick Diaz are we going to get after 5 years off? That's great. He's done a diet. That's great. He's been doing triathlons, but that's completely different than actually being in the octagon. So I'm in the minority here. I probably, I'm on an island by myself, but I do not want to see Nick Diaz come back to the UFC. I think he's done more than enough in the octagon already. He's had a couple title shots. He's, been a fan favorite, but I just don't think the Nick Diaz that everyone thinks we're going to get when he comes back is going to be the Nick Diaz we're going to see in there. Remember Robbie Lawler a few weeks ago? Remember when everyone was like, Robbie's going to knock out Neil Magny and he's going to be great? That's what I think we're going to see with Nick Diaz when he comes back. I don't think we're going to see anything close to what we saw 5 years ago in the octagon. So I'm of the minority here that I don't want to see Nick Diaz come back. And I also don't think we should get excited until he actually steps into the octagon and takes a fight. So that's my thoughts on Nick Diaz. Not a fan. Don't think he should come back. That's just my opinion on that. I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of people upset by that, but I'm just calling it like it is. Even you biggest Diaz fans, he's not going to be the same guy. Let's be honest here. Okay, so we got 2 Bellator cards coming up here. We're going to zoom through them as we're sort of wrapping up the show. Pretty actually decent cards. So Friday's card is Bellator 245. We have the rematch between Phil Davis and Lyoto Machida. We do have some odds up here on BlitzBet, so we'll get into those. We have right now Lyoto Machida as the underdog at plus 270, Phil Davis at minus 345 on BlitzBet. That makes sense. Davis has looked a little bit better over the last little stretch here. Machida had that loss to Gegard Mousasi last year. And I think overall, Phil can always rely on his wrestling. In terms of his skill set, the Lyoto Machida that we're used to seeing is not the Lyoto Machida from a few years ago. Machida, 42 years old now. Phil Davis, 35. I mean, he's not young either, but he is coming off back-to-back wins. I like Phil Davis in this fight to get a decision. It's not going to be pretty, but I think he'll end up winning just a decision with his wrestling. We've got Kat Zingano taking on Gabrielle Holloway. I'll be completely honest, I don't know a ton about Gabrielle Holloway, but I do know she has a 6-5 record. And I do know Kat Zingano at 38 years old has not fought since the Megan Anderson fight in December of 2018. So really long layoff for her coming back. She's also fighting at featherweight again, probably as an potential opponent for Chris Cyborg down the line. Holloway has lost 2 of her last 3 fights, lost to Amanda Bell and Arlene Blenko, is coming off a win over Alexis Dunfries in her last fight at Bellator 174. I'll go Zingano by decision, but if you guys are betting this fight, I would stay far away. Do we have bet odds for this one? We do. Zingano is minus 588. There's no way I would bet that on this fight with Zingano not fighting as long as she has. So I would stay away from that personally. And Gabrielle Holloway at plus 420, you might even take a stab with that just in case. I mean, that's some crazy odds there in terms of that matchup. Ed Ruth, Taylor Johnson, really interesting fight here. Taylor Johnson, if you guys remember, was on Contender Series last year, ended up losing his fight. I believe it was to Andre Muniz, actually, who I mentioned earlier. So he's now re-upped with Bellator to a multi-fight deal. Johnson training at American Top Team Portland for this camp. Switched things up. He's now back home training there. So he's getting to work with guys like Ed Herman and Austin Vanderford. So really good camp for him heading into this one. And Ed Ruth, going to be trying to get another win here. He's coming off that loss to Amasov in his last fight earlier this year. He's 2-2 in his last 4 fights, losing to really good guys. I think just with the wrestling, you'd have to favor Ed Ruth here, so I'll take Ruth by decision in that one. And then also on the main card, we have Raymond Daniels taking on 5-4 Peter Stenoik. Don't know much about Peter Stenoik. I know what Raymond Daniels brings to the table, and Raymond Daniels right now is minus 286. He probably gets it done with his kickboxing background, probably gets a knockout in this one, so don't have a great read on that fight, but I would go with Raymond Daniels. The only other fight I'll point out on this card, well, there's 2 I'll quickly point out. We got Keith Lee, the brother of Kevin Lee, taking on Vinicius Zaney. Really interesting fight for Keith, who's going to be a dad coming up here. He is the brother of Kevin Lee. Got a big win over Sean Bunch in his last fight. Keith Lee, I think, could potentially get in the win column on this one. Zaney's a vet, though. 17 fights. Keith Lee only 9 fights. I'll take Keith Lee in this one to get it done, but I'd be a little bit careful about that one in terms of the odds. And then we have a really interesting fight in the women's featherweight division, Leslie Smith against Amanda Bell. I'll take Smith by decision. Bell's been up and down in her career. She actually is 7-6, whereas Smith, has fought some pretty good competition in the UFC. I tend to lean towards her in this fight, in another fight that could be a potential opponent for Chris Cyborg down the line. Let's get to Bellator 246. This card actually, in my opinion, kind of rivals the UFC card this weekend. They got a really good title fight in the main event. We'll get right into it here. We've got Juan Archuleta taking on Patchy Mix. If you guys didn't catch our interview with Juan Archuleta on this channel, go check it out after you're done watching the show. Archuleta going to be having TJ Dillashaw in his corner. There's some question about that with Dillashaw having that suspension for PED, so he will be in his corner for his fight. That will be very interesting, this one. Archuleta says he's basically going to big brother Patchy Mix over 5 rounds. We'll see. I mean, Archuleta is a guy that's fought as heavy as 155, whereas Mix is a guy that has fought as low as flyweight. So we'll see how the size plays into this one. Let's quickly talk about the height and reach as we're wrapping things up here very quickly. Archuleta 5'7" with a 69-inch reach. Patchy Mix 5'11" with a 72-inch reach. So actually, it's going to be Mix that's going to be the bigger fighter in this one. So that will be a little bit interesting in the matchup. I do got to go with the smaller fighter or sorry, not the smaller fighter. I got to go with the younger fighter here in Patchy Mix, 27 years old. He's going out there and he's finishing his opponents. If you want to use a comparison here, he went out there and finished Ricky Bandejas in the very first round, whereas Archuleta won a very close fight between them. Even though Archuleta's, look good overall, I think Mix is just look a little bit better, and I give him a slight edge here. The question is, can Mix finish Archuleta? I'm not sure. I think it might end up going the distance in this one. We'll see what happens, but Archuleta has a pretty solid ground game as well, too. I would personally stay away from this fight. I think this is about as even as it gets, with Archuleta having a little bit more experience in terms of his fights, and Mix, I think, just having more upside. Mix comes to us from Jackson Wink, whereas Archuleta training with TJ Dillashaw, Cub Swanson, Brian Ortega, sort of that super camp over there. So they both come from good camps here as well, too. So the pick will be Mix, but I would stay away from this one and just sit back and enjoy who will be the new Bellator champion. We got John Fitch and Neiman Gracie in the co-main event. Fitch coming out of retirement, so to speak. There were some talks about him hanging them up. I'll take Fitch by decision in this one. I don't see him getting submitted by Neiman Gracie, and I think just like the Rory McDonald fight, I think Fitch's experience will be too much. Gracie's only got 10 fights. That's a huge gap in experience. I'll go with the vet in John Fitch, who, by the way, I thought beat Rory McDonald last year as well, too. Liz Carmouche, Deanna Bennett. Give me Liz Carmouche by decision here in her Bellator debut. I think she's a better fighter than Bennett. Carmouche hasn't fought since the Shevchenko fight, so a bit of a layoff coming into this one, but I think Carmouche will get the job done in this fight in terms of her skill set and everything else. Do we have odds for the Liz Carmouche fight? We do not, but I'm sure they'll get those up here soon. And then the only other notable fight here, Derek Campos and Keone Diggs. Diggs undefeated, Campos 20-10 record. Diggs stepping up on short notice for Austin Vanderford here. He's stepping up for Roger Huerta. Sorry, that was the fight that got changed up. Give me Campos, maybe because of experience. Give me by decision in this fight, although Diggs is undefeated, so we'll see how he handles this fight on short notice. But I'll go Campos just because he's had a full camp for this one and gets the job done there. All right, good time to end the show here, guys. Really appreciate you guys tuning in this week. Make sure you check out our interviews on the channel, like I said, with Michelle Waterson, Andrea Lee, Juan Archuleta. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. All my best interviews go here on this channel, so you guys can tune into that every week, along with Octagon Outlook that we do every week at 1:15 p.m. Eastern Time. Make sure you guys are subscribed so you don't miss any of the content that we have here on the channel. I'm James Lynch. I will see you guys back here next week, 1:15 p.m. Eastern Time. For all you Canadians, enjoy your Labor Day. To the rest of you, enjoy the fights this weekend. It's going to be a busy one, and I will be right back here next Monday for another edition of Octagon Outlook. I hope you guys have a great day.